Yasmien. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here with us at Workspaces. Very quickly, I guess, can you give us, your role and your current focus at TD Bank to kick us off and give us some context?
Sure. First, I'll just ask, does anyone know TD Bank in the room? I know you know TD Bank, Tyler. So TD, I'll give you a bit of context for those of you that don't know TD. So TD actually stands for Toronto Dominion Bank. A lot of folks on the US side actually don't know that, mainly because we're marketed as America's most convenient bank. We're about 95,000 employees across the globe, most of them up in Canada. And then we have about, of the 95, about 27,000 in the US. We're about 170 years old, and we're only about 20 years old in the US. And so my role is essentially any space that a customer or a colleague is in falls with my team. There's about 28 folks on the team, all over the place, everywhere from Thunder Bay for the Canadians in the room, all the way down to Florida. And essentially we craft the experiences for our colleagues and our customers across our retail and our corporate network. So that's call center, corporate, wealth, capital markets, you name it. And then now I've just moved into this role about 6 months ago into our ground floor retail branches. And then I'll mention one last thing, which is in Canada, we are also an insurance company as well. So it's kind of a big broad spectrum. Yeah.
Thank you for the overview. And in terms of the involvement here at Workspaces, I used to live in Toronto a few years back, and I was recently visiting.
And you left.
I left. Well, it was only kind of 7 months or so, so living is a kind of liberal term there. But I was visiting a friend, and I stepped out of Union Station there in Toronto, and I saw this building, and it kind of blew me away. I had no idea that it was being built or was already being built. And I guess you opened that earlier this year, that's right?
Yes, that's right, that's right. I think it's supposed to be looping.
Yeah, we're going to start looping some of the images there, and you guys can see those. But I guess, look, you call it a vertical city there. It's very striking. I mean, can you walk us through this project?
Yes, I'll give you some context. So this building is in stark contrast to the rest of our corporate campuses. For those of you that have been in Toronto, you'll know Toronto Dominion Bank is really sort of a heritage beacon. We have the benefit, I don't know if any of our other FIs are in here, but we essentially have a big courtyard in between, right downtown, right outside of Union Station. And two of our buildings are, Mies van der Rohe, so heritage buildings. So when you look at the Toronto skyline, if any of you watch the Raptors games, any Raptors fans in the room? Yes, some Raptors fans. Okay, I haven't lost it altogether. So when you look at the Toronto skyline, you'll see TD Centre, which has this very Miesian kind of visibility. You'll also see 161 Bay, which has this big digital crown up above. And then now we have TD Terrace. So you kind of see the spectrum of TD's legacy and what it means. And truly, it is all over the skyline, and really a source of pride for us representing Toronto, which used to be the Bank of Toronto originally in 1855. So, but in contrast, this building is one building. It's not multiple complexes with a courtyard in between. And we were designing this, we started designing in end of 2019, beginning of 2020, which was really challenging once we got into, whatever happened between 2020 and now. So a lot of what we were doing had to be done virtually. And you add in the complexity of trying to create this kind of campus within a standalone building, and we said, you know what? We didn't even know who was moving into this space, but we knew it was within close proximity to our other campuses. And so what we said is, you know what? Let's conceive of this as a city. So similar to any great city, we said, we need to put in the infrastructure to really kind of foster the type of culture that we want to thrive in this space. And then we wanted to also pull in a lot of the insights that we'd heard along the way. So we kind of had a blank canvas, which rarely happens. And in this case, it was honestly a gift because we were able to create an environment that really addressed a lot of the opportunities and the potential of those opportunities without being hindered by, somebody saying I have the biggest P&L and so therefore, I need to be at the top of the building. We could actually conceive of this as a blank canvas. And so one of the big things that we decided to commit to early is, because my team's role crosses so many different businesses, one of the things about TD that's pretty well known is it's a very organic culture. Very organic, as in there are microcultures the diversity of the cultures within the businesses tends to differ more than anything that I've ever come across. So I come from a design consulting background, so I've worked with all kinds of different companies across the world. And coming to the bank, I thought that might be stifled. And it's been the opposite. We're not a top-down organization. And so I think for us, that was quite liberating. And so one of the things that we committed to very early is that we noticed that there was distinction in the experiences that colleagues were having based on who their manager was, what team they were in, where we were in the depreciation cycle, what type of space they were currently in. And so we wanted to start with this baseline experience. And so we'd refer to it as your bill of rights as a TD colleague. Doesn't matter who you report into or what's the baseline, knowing that we weren't going to have a blank check across our portfolio. And once we started with the baseline, and it kind of took off from there. So one of the fundamental principles about this space is that it leveraged a lot of the pilots that we'd done before, but it also centered on this two concepts, is dignity first, and access. So as my daughter, she uses decolonization in a lot of her sentences. So decolonizing a lot of our spaces, or probably better said, democratizing access, universal access to a more universal experience. And we'll talk about some of the ways that kind of manifested, and I'll tell you a little bit about how it's been going.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, well, let's cover off on some quick facts, I guess, about the building. So when did it open? It was earlier this year?
The first group moved in end of May, June of this year.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And it's been phased or in stages?
It's phased, yeah. I think the last group is moving in 3 weeks. So that's 15,000 colleagues mapped to this building. So about 15% of our population. It's not insignificant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And across 95,000 in total, you were saying?
Correct, okay. Yeah.
What's the breakdown of those employees between the Canada and the US? Do you know? Or?
In terms of our colleagues?
Yeah.
I want to say about 70,000 colleagues are in Canada.
Okay.
And then the rest, about 27 are in the US.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they operate as separate entities, right?
They are. So TD Bank Group is TD Bank Group. It's headquartered in Toronto. And then everything else, including US, is a subsidiary of TD Bank. Yeah.
Okay.
But we are separate banks. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that'll be a bit more relevant as we get further on into this. I want to come back to that.
Sure.
And I guess so the breakdown of the types of employees you have in this building across, is it the
Yes.
full spectrum?
Yes. So the corporate planners say all the cool kids have moved into this building, which I think is really unfair because we're not in the building. Very unfair. I'm like,
right.
What do you mean? So we have three major groups that moved into this building. And I think actually what's been most interesting for us as observers of not only the cultures but the different operating models that exist in the bank is that it's almost like we had two different parts of TD over the past couple of years, especially over the pandemic. You had one part that's, let's call it progressive in terms of the way that they wanted to work. So going into big programs like Next Evolution of Work, which is really just agile and scaled to a degree that we hadn't seen before. And then you had, let's call it, I don't like using the word conservative, but sort of the waterfall crew, right? So you have these different perspectives about how work should be done. And we didn't know who was moving in. So we started with this very basic kind of agnostic approach, right? Is what are the fundamentals that we want to layer into this experience? So when I talk about access, one of the things that we were very resolute about from the very beginning is it's not really up to us to decide what's the right scale. Because after having a couple of conversations with different teams, you'd ask, okay, so you're part of this agile crew. What's the size of your team? What are your rituals? And they'd say, it's about 7 people. And then next, 25 people. And then next it was like 100 people. Oh, and then there was another team that gets together like once every 2 months, and it's about 1,000 people. And so you're working with such a variety of scale that we said, you know what, let's actually step back from that. Let's not impose any unnecessary spatial boundaries on ourselves. And so we're in 33 floors. We're in the base of the building, we're in the top of the building, and then in between, sandwiched between us is Ontario Teachers' Pension. So there's really only 2 tenants in this building. And of the 33 floors, about 28 of them are fully interconnected, meaning there's a big green ribbon stair that links all of our floors, which for those of you that are familiar with the Toronto market, some of our, let's call them competitors in the other FIs, decided that 3 floors was actually the sweet spot. And we weren't actually sure that that was the case. So we said, you know what? We're actually going to interlink all the floors. And then we'll have to figure out how we kind of how we conceive of some of the like psychological boundaries that will help leaders actually feel more comfortable, but actually empower the colleagues to go wherever they want to go, wherever they need to go, and choose their own adventure, just like in a city. And so what that does is it kind of like balances out I'll actually just say it, is it actually takes away the authority of a people leader to directly and possibly negatively take away that level of autonomy that a colleague should have. Remember, we start with, if you work for TD, regardless of where you are, understanding that we operate in different jurisdictions, not just in the US or in Europe or in Canada, and that the laws change, is that like an embassy, your experience is going to be universally consistent in terms of the level of access that you have. And so because of that, it's like a fundamental principle. You say, okay, well, we want people to be able to go where they want to go, where they need to go. And that what that does is it balances that, again, that level of ability to detract from someone's autonomy. Having said that, we know that the rituals tend to differ on different teams, and that's not for us on the real estate side to decide or determine, but it did kind of balance out that experience.
Mm-hmm. How is that staircase and that idea and concept kind of, or how is it performing, or what's the impact that that's having on folks in that building? Do people run up that thing for exercise? Some people do, yeah.
Somebody in here said there was a couple of people running this morning, so kudos to you. I was asleep, but yes, the runners are runners wherever you go. You know what? Some people are always going to wait for the elevators, and others are actually, kind of embracing it. There is so I said the last group is moving in November, so we're actually watching very closely to understand like how far is too far. Because part of the principles that we also layered in is that there is such a thing as something being too far. So one good example is, we were in a bunch of different buildings in downtown core. And some of those buildings had folks that have a need, right? And one of the key aspects of what we do is it's actually not up to us to decide the validity of someone's need. So once a colleague says they have a need, what we need to do is essentially respond to that need. As long as it's not detracting from someone else's experience, then it's valid. So the depth of understanding, and I know, there's differences, I think, in terms of like Canada versus US, and we see that, but we really don't need to validate why, how do we say this, why someone has that need. Does that make sense? Meaning, if someone wants to go pray at work, okay, cool, we gotta create a space for that. If someone wants to use an all-gender washroom, great, we're gonna provide for that. I don't need to understand necessarily why someone feels that way. It's more that we just need to do our job, and our job is creating the environments,
right.
providing those environments for colleagues. And then some folks are not going to use it, and then others are, right? And part of making that business case was actually really interesting because, you know, I'll give another example. In Canada, we have, you can take 18 months for parental leave. And so I had a colleague say, like, why do we need these? They used to be called mother's rooms. They're lactation rooms now. Like, why do we need these? And I'm like, I mean, number one, not everyone can afford to take 18 months off, even though it is paid. But two, some people, even if it was fully paid, would opt out of that. It's about your choices, having the autonomy and ability to make choices. And so, and then again, it's about the universality of that experience, meaning if I'm in our South Carolina office or if I'm in Thunder Bay, I know I have access to some of the things that I want to access, and then others are going to opt out of those things. Mm-hmm. So like I said, I actually thought coming to the bank, I've been there 7 years, and when I first got there, you'd ask people, like, how long have you been here? Everybody was double digits. It's so weird. I'm like, what is going on? And I think it's because of that space that each individual colleague generally has, that you can actually carve out really unique experiences like we have. You're able to meet folks in the moment, mm-hmm. right?
So it's intrinsically woven into the values of the company, is what you're saying.
100%. Okay. And you know, our CEO, we have a new CEO coming in April. He says this almost at every occasion where you know it makes sense. And I'll tell you, I've heard it at least. You hear it about 8 times a year at minimum, which is that we can debate about what the best solution is, but our values are not up for debate. And integral to those values is equity. Mm-hmm. And I think that even though I didn't have a mandate to create equitable spaces, I think what that does is says, actually, your job is to make sure that you're providing equity. You're weaving it into the products that you're selling your customers. You're weaving it into however you touch each colleague along the way. And so I think what that does is that's the only top-down element that I've come across there. And I know that sounds like an exaggeration, but truly, our values are not up for debate. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Interesting. So then, I mean, in the focus of this session, you know, it's called Inside the Journey Toward Inclusive Workplaces at TD Bank. So then, how is this a departure from what you would normally have in your workplaces? And then what was the purpose of this project within sort of, you know, aligning with the values? And then looking forward, what's the point of it? Yeah.
What's the point? So I'd say that this hits about, like I said, 15% of our colleague population. There's still 85% right. of our colleagues that are not in a space where we have purpose-built. Like, I took my son to this space and he was like, oh my God, this is so cool. And I'm like, don't fall for it. You're Gen Z. Like, you're not supposed to fall for this stuff.
Because
like, he didn't want to leave.
The rest of your portfolio does not look like this, right?
It has the key elements. So the baseline experience. Okay. So like, we may not have a purpose-built retreat, but we do have multifunctional spaces that allow us to tailor those experiences based on the inputs from our colleagues, but to tailor those experiences. So, you know, like our Ottawa campus was a big pilot for us, and that's a campus made up of, this campus is pretty much all knowledge workers. There's no capital markets folks or anything like that. Okay. Definitely no call center. But Ottawa was call center and corporate. And over the years, we're like, why are we making this distinction? Yes, the rituals of how a call center worker, like their schedule is different, but their needs are pretty well the same. They're human needs, right? And so bringing those two aspects closer, because the intention is if you work for TD, then you will have access, you will be experiencing an equitable experience. And we have come across, I am not, you know, to be totally frank, like, and I'm sure some folks in the room have probably come across some challenges when you're trying to make the business, like making the business case when we were in finance versus HR, and now we're in the transformation office, very different, but ultimately the outcome is the same. And we have come across, you know, I remember there's this one woman who shall not be named, and she said, you know, why do we need these all-gender washrooms? Like, this is Red Deer, Alberta. And I'm like, is it a TD space? She goes, yeah. So I said, okay, well then it's going to have an all-gender universal washroom, right? Like you don't get to opt out of some of the fundamental aspects. These spaces are not amenities. The policies are not optional as it pertains to that baseline. This is what it's like to work here.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you get, is that common to get that kind of pushback in terms of, you know, what's the ROI of this? Why invest in this, and what does it give to the company?
No, I would say that because we have a pretty good, number one, the dollars make sense. So our cost per seat is lower than it was, but our experiences are exponentially better.
Okay, right.
So the business case for it from an expense perspective is great. And then the business case for it from an experience perspective is even better. But it's actually that it's kind of a win, it's a win-win, right? Mm-hmm. And we have like our space is kind of a living, like the real estate space at TD is a living showroom. So we're able to kick the tires before we go out and do it. We're in about 22 million square feet in total. That includes our branch network. So it's about 12 million square feet of corporate space. But, you know, one wrong decision and you might have an impact on like 30 floors, right? And so we try to test and experiment on our own spaces, in our own space first, and then we'll roll it out once we are convinced. But we also bring in a lot of colleagues from across the organization to help us see what we can't see. And then I'll also mention that our team, the team that is doing this, is also very diverse. Not just diverse in our experiences, but like racially diverse from a gender perspective, from all aspects. And that actually helps to inform the solutions that we're coming up with, helps us to try to kind of stay ahead of and hopefully eventually we'll get to a place, well, we'll see how things go. Yeah.
When we were having discussions and planning for this, one of the things that stood out to me was that it's in the design of the spaces, and we can see how varied it is here. It's very nuanced. You know, it's like the details seem to be, when you're telling me some of these things and the initiatives, and I think that was really key. I guess, can you give us some examples of how that impacts employees and how that sort of enhances their experience when they're in the building?
Yeah. So I think, coming into TD, a lot of of course, we met whatever the code requirements are, and like I said, they vary based on jurisdiction, but we weren't layering in preference. And I'll give an example. You know, we can have, you know, barrier-free sinks, for example, right? But the actual orientation was not necessarily factored for. And those are things that, like I said earlier, like one of the fundamental principles or like ethos of the team is we're not gonna question, if someone has a need, it's not really up to us to question it unless that need is going to detract from someone else's experience. You know what I'm saying? Like the Red Deer example I just gave. And so I think like you have to assume, what am I trying to say? You have to assume positive intent, but you also have to kind of play this role where you are balancing the equation.
Okay. You
know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Not really. Well, I mean, yes. Can you
ask the question again? Ask the question again. I'll answer it more, maybe with a bit more.
Yeah, I just know there were some design elements when you were talking to me about it that I guess didn't seem to me that would have
occurred to you.
Or to, I guess, when you think about what it means to build a space that takes everybody's needs into consideration. Yeah.
So I'll give an example of how you can show up more authentically, right? So for those of you that are not aware, we have on the Canadian side, really a commitment to truth and reconciliation that goes through. It's across the country. It's really about not just actually first off finding out what happened to residential school survivors, but really understanding the Indigenous experience in a very authentic way and hearing from Indigenous voices. So one of the things that we want to do is actually understand how we can interact with indigenous peoples and how that shows up in our space. So has anyone heard of legacy spaces here? Okay, well, you can Google it after the fact. But I think what that meant is rather than kind of tokenizing this, right? Because you can tokenize some of these solutions, right? And say, hey, look, we're doing a great job. And is actually having an authentic, creating the capacity to have an authentic depth of understanding to the best of our ability about someone else's experience. And no matter what, I think you acknowledge that, like, as much as you tell me about your experience, I'm never going to be able to fully experience it and understand it. And so what we decided to do is actually, number one, not just pull in indigenous colleagues into a lot of our solutions, but also understand how we should be interacting and representing and educating our colleagues in a really authentic way. And so one of the things we did, is going to sound really silly, so legacy spaces essentially are spaces that are within your real estate portfolio or footprint that are, I would say, dedicated to fostering education or conversation around the indigenous experience. And that links back into the truth and reconciliation aspect. So a lot of spaces that you go into, like all of our spaces have land acknowledgements within them. And like my kids in school, I'm an immigrant. I've always been an immigrant, not just to Canada, but to the country I was in before, which is the UAE. I'm from Sudan. And so, you know, part of that experience of being an indigenous person, I don't necessarily understand. I understand the experience of being an indigenous person as an African, right? But also as an immigrant to a country. So my point in telling you that is that it went beyond putting a land acknowledgement up on the wall. It was pulling in our indigenous banking division, asking them, how can we actually work with tribal councils in an authentic way? And that pace is a very different pace than we would have liked. It took us 2 years just to have to figure out how we were going to integrate education about indigenous peoples in our spaces, but also honor them, right? So that's an example of one aspect of not tokenizing an experience. But then there's practical things like, you know, a colleague in a wheelchair was telling us, as I was saying earlier, about orientation. We invited them to the table, and we continue to invite them. And they said, we just don't, you know, we don't feel seen. And that layered into a lot of things, like in our renderings, beyond, again, code, in our renderings, you will see colleagues with disabilities. Those are physical disabilities, but also being invited to the table to weigh in on what the solutions are. So one colleague said, you know, the spaces are barrier-free, but the orientation, when I come up to a microwave, something like so simple, day to day, is actually has me coming up on the side. And they said, I know it's legal, but that means that I'm almost gonna drop a hot plate of food, and I have done that before, on my lap. And he said, even though I don't feel it, because I can't feel from my hips down, it actually takes away from my quality of life. And we're like, oh my God, this is so obvious, as he stated it. But he said, I said, well, why didn't you say anything, you know, before? I was fairly new to the organization. He said, I didn't think anyone would listen. So, and that's not actually a reflection of TD, because actually it's a space where anyone will listen. But it was more that the infrastructure and the environment to invite these suggestions and opinions sometimes, right, or preferences wasn't necessarily there.
Right.
Yeah.
And thank you for
I think I answered your question.
No, that was wonderful. Thank you for, and I think that's what I was trying to articulate, because it's what are the elements that need to happen within an organization and a team working on this to not make it feel tokenized and just completely, like, the effort was put in, but it just didn't land properly. And that sort of nuanced, authentic approach. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at, and it seems to work. I mean, what you guys are building and working on is so fantastic. I guess what has been your experience prior to TD Bank with other organizations? And I guess how do you see the lay of the land in general with the way that corporations, organizations approach this?
For me, if the team doesn't have a diversity of experiences, sometimes it can translate into inauthentic solutions. Meaning, again, like actually, we rarely share or show what our spaces look like. So I don't know if you're going to be sending this PDF out later. I'm just letting you know right now. But,
Sure.
For no other reason other than like, I don't know. I don't really care about winning the awards at the end of the day. I do care about our colleagues' sentiment and their sense of belonging. And we were having a conversation about that earlier, Gokul, right? Their sense of belonging and also their sense of not feeling like otherized. Because I'll tell you, I walk into a lot of rooms and people automatically assume, because all they see is a headscarf and they're like automatically assuming what I stand for and whatever. You have no idea, like, and what I want to say is actually you have no idea who I am or what my value set is. But you know that there are going to be perceptions around like, you know, what helps and what doesn't. And I think people with disabilities particularly have been quite vocal with us about, you know, people automatically assume that we you know, I need help. Actually, no, I have the empowerment. I actually don't want to rely on others for anything. I want to have an equitable experience just like every single other colleague in this organization. It's a fair thing to want and need. It shouldn't really be a desire. It should be table stakes, right? So, yeah, it's been before this, I was in consulting. So, you know, I've spent about 20 years on the service provider side, mainly in design firms all over the place, Canada, US, Canada, Australia, and Dubai. And I think coming onto the quote unquote client side really gives you this different perspective of like, oh, that's why they're so dysfunctional. Right. I'm just kidding. Like, oh, okay, that's why. I'm only half kidding. But it's more so that I thought coming in as a designer, my background is experience design, interior design, et cetera. I was like, what the hell am I going to do in a bank? I didn't realize actually that what we do has, like in this particular position, the way that it is set up, I have so much ability to directly impact the quality of life for colleagues. And that is a really, I just told you, it's almost 100,000 colleagues, and let alone the customers. We serve about 28 million customers. That's like powerful. That's crazy. One decision around a microwave, like I gave a silly example, right? It has an impact on 100,000 people. That's wild. So I think I'm sure there's designers in the room, I didn't know how it was going to translate. I thought, oh my God, I'm going to the bank. I kind of fell into the role at the bank. And then I realized that about a year in that there's like real ability to make a change and to make a difference. And there's no script or like plan on how to do that, and that was very liberating. And so far, you know, it's been a really cool ride. So I'm almost hitting the double digits now, which is like wild to me. So anyway, so you know, it's a bank, but it's so much more than that. And I'm not here caping for TD, by the way, but I will tell you that my experience has been that, number one, actually the diversity in our leadership is profound, and there's always more work to do. Mm-hmm. But actually that some of the most provocative discussions that I've been in, and I've worked in boutique and really large-scale firms and firms all over the world, have been in the bank, because there's space. There's so much space and if there isn't space, you can create the space, and no, you know, people don't really get in the way of that. That is what it means to work here. Mm-hmm. And there's ability to contribute to something that's like bigger than us. And I think that goes a long way. And it really is at the core of like the TD Ready commitment. I think people really live those values. Yeah.
And I touched on earlier just about, I guess, the distinction between the US and Canada.
Yeah.
There's something I think that feels uniquely something about Canada that feeds into what's happening at TD Bank. And I guess, do you notice that kind of difference there across the border in the approach and openness to this?
Yes, I think in recent years, the US, I mean, like we all read the headlines, right? So navigating, the US is just generally more litigious. So some of the insights that we pull in, I didn't talk about it, but it's beyond kind of observational data. And, you know, I was kind of talking about people being able to approach us. And from an HR perspective, there's like a self-ID campaign. So you can self-identify, which I actually didn't know what that was when I first joined the bank. And I'm like, well, I don't know if I want to, you know, put down on paper how I identify. But actually the intention behind it is that if you want to create equitable experiences, you kind of have to actually understand, you have to be able to reach out to folks. So in the US, you can't do that. So you can't necessarily, like I was explaining to my 9-year-old the difference between equality and equity, right? Because he was using the words kind of interchangeably. And I'm like, no. And then I showed him the tree graphic. And I think in Canada, at least my experience in terms of navigating this and trying to solve business problems is you can actually kind of get right to the source if given permission to do so. So for example, I could self-identify as Black or from African descent, as a woman, et cetera, right? And so HR is actually able to canvas when there are programs specifically for Black colleagues. They're able to directly reach out. In the US, it's different, right? And I think that has changed, I think, with some of the Supreme Court decisions. But it doesn't mean that we can't actually provide the access to programs from an HR. And I'm not from HR, by the way, so if there's any HR folks in the room, you can tell me better, you can educate me a bit more. But so you have to kind of pivot. But from a real estate perspective, we actually don't change the product, right? The experience, I called it an embassy earlier, like truly, where you see the TD shield, which is our logo, that's a TD space. And so that space is gonna have all gender washrooms, regardless of the state that you're in. And so that space will have lactation rooms, and it will have group prayer rooms, and it will have, you know, it'll have the full gamut of all the things that we wanna provide our colleagues beyond inclusive spaces. But definitely including inclusive spaces. And we haven't really run into any major challenges because, as I said, those spaces are kind of part and parcel. There's all kinds of there's a variety of different experiences and spaces that we can provide, especially when we're activating experiences. But they're really based on what colleagues are telling us they want. And then, again, additive rather than reductive from the experience. Like, we're not going to remove, you know, some of these crucial elements just because someone feels uncomfortable. Just don't use them then. Yeah.
Yasmien, there's so many other areas directions I wanted to take this, but we are coming to the end of it. Do we have time for a question? Oh, yeah.
We have time for, I guess, for like one question, yeah.
Does anybody have anything?
No math questions.
Any questions?
No questions.
Look, Yasmien, thank you so much.
You guys they're ready for the disco later, I can tell.
We're about ready for it. Look, thank you so much for sharing it, and I wish we could talk more about that, many other questions. But thank you so much for sharing this, and all the best for the future of this and rolling.